Penitentiary have been closed to prisoners for decades, but something inside those crumbling stone walls has never truly left. Built in 1829 on a hill overlooking Philadelphia, this was not meant to be an ordinary prison. It was designed as an experiment in total isolation, a place where inmates would spend their sentences in complete silence, hooded whenever they were moved so they could never see another human face, locked alone in stone cells meant to force reflection through solitude. The architects believed that silence and isolation would cure the criminal mind. What they built instead was a machine for manufacturing madness, and the echoes of that madness have soaked into the walls ever since. The building itself was designed like the spokes of a wheel, 7 long cell blocks radiating out from a central hub, so that guards could watch every corridor at once. Thick stone walls, narrow skylights, called the Eye of God, meant to remind prisoners that they were always being watched. Tiny exercise yards attached to each cell, where a man could pace for exactly 1 hour a day and see nothing but sky. Prisoners were given a number instead of a name. They were forbidden to speak, forbidden to sing, forbidden to make any sound that might remind them they were still part of the human world. Some lasted years like this. Others lasted weeks before their minds simply broke apart. Guards later testified that certain cells seemed to swallow men whole. Inmates would enter functioning, if frightened, and within months they were found curled in corners, whispering to walls, clawing at stone, convinced that something unseen was standing behind them in the dark. Punishment for breaking the rules of silence was brutal. Men were strapped into a device called the mad chair, bound so tightly that blood flow was cut off to their limbs for days at a time. Others were subjected to the water bath, dunked in freezing water, and left chained to a wall through the coldest nights of Pennsylvania winter, their skin sometimes freezing to the stone itself. There was a punishment block, cells buried below ground with no light at all, called the Klondike, where a man could be left for 2 weeks in total blackness, with barely enough air to breathe. Several men died down there, their bodies were removed quietly, and the punishments continued as though nothing had happened. By the time the penitentiary finally closed its doors in 1971, it had swallowed over 80,000 inmates across more than a century, and among them were murderers, including the notorious Al Capone, who once occupied a cell furnished almost like a hotel room, and who reportedly screamed through the nights, begging unseen guards to make the voice of a man he had ordered killed stop calling his name. The prison sat abandoned for over 20 years after closing, its cell blocks left to decay, ceilings collapsing, ivy swallowing the stone, rust bleeding down the walls like old wounds reopening. It was during those decaying years that stories began traveling through Philadelphia, stories that would eventually turn Eastern State into one of the most documented haunted locations in the world. Cellblock 12 became known among staff and visitors alike as the epicenter of the activity. People walking through report a wall of cold air that has no natural explanation, a cold that clings to skin even on humid summer afternoons. Shadow figures are seen slipping between cell doorways, moving with a strang, jerking gait, as though the body doing the moving is not entirely in control of itself. Some visitors describe faces appearing in the reflective surfaces of old metal fixtures, faces that are not their own, faces with hollow eyes and open, silent mouths, as though still bound by that century-old rule of forced silence, screaming without ever being allowed to make a sound. In the room, referred to as the synagogue, once used for prisoner services, cleaning staff and security guards have reported disembodied laughter echoing off the walls. At hours when the building is completely empty and locked, investigators using audio equipment have captured recordings of what sound like multiple voices, whispering just below the threshold of comprehension, layered over each other as though a crowd of unseen men were still standing shoulder to shoulder in a space built to keep them apart. Some recordings, when slowed down, seem to form fragments of words in old immigrant dialects that once filled the prison population, voices calling out numbers instead of names, the only identity these men were ever permitted. The guard towers hold their own dark reputation. Security personnel doing solo night shifts have reported the powerful sensation of being watched from the empty yards below, a pressure on the back of the neck so intense that several guards refuse to work alone in that section after dark. One night watchman described seeing a solitary figure pacing in one of the small triangular exercise yards attached to a cell long since abandoned, walking the exact psalm-worn path prisoners once wore into the stone during their single permitted hour outside. When he called out, the figure stopped, turned toward him with no visible face beneath its hood, and simply dissolved into the darkness like smoke pulled apart by wind. Paranormal investigators who have spent nights locked inside describe a presence they call the Shadow Man, a tall, impossibly thin figure that moves along the upper walkways of the cell blocks, visible only in peripheral vision, vanishing completely the moment anyone turns to look directly at it. Electronic equipment left running through the night frequently malfunctions in specific cells, batteries draining within minutes despite being fully charged, temperature gauges dropping without warning by 10 or 15 degrees intercons only to return to normal just as suddenly. In the room once used as an infirmary and later cited for horrific experiments performed on prisoners, some visitors report the overwhelming smell of blood and rust, a smell so real that people have been physically sick and had to leave the building. Locksmiths hired to restore old cell doors have reported doors they had just secured swinging open again on their own, the sound of the mechanism turning audible from empty corridors when no living hand was anywhere near it. Cleaning crews refused certain sections after dark, citing the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth in locked cells, footsteps that stop the instant a light is shone through the small barred window, leaving nothing behind but empty stone and silence. Perhaps the most unsettling detail those who study Eastern State return to again and again is this. The prison was built on the principle that total isolation and enforced silence would purify a broken mind. Instead, it seems to have trapped something inside those walls that was never able to leave. Souls bound to the very silence that was pacing the small stone yards where they once glimpsed a narrow strip of open sky, forever reaching for a voice they were never allowed to use in life, and may still be searching for now somewhere deep within the cold, decaying stone of Eastern State Penitentiary.